The Zephyrian Military Academy had graduated 17,000 officers over 3 centuries, and not one of them had ever seen someone catch a bullet with their bare hand. This was about to change, though nobody in the amphitheater knew it yet. General Korthak stood at the podium, his 4 arms crossed in what passed for dignified authority among his species. The assembled faculty, a rainbow of chitinous, scaled, and tentacled beings from across the hegemony, waited with the sort of polite attention reserved for tedious administrative announcements. Behind them, 300 cadets from 47 worlds sat in perfect formation, their various appendages folded in regulation poses. "Distinguished colleagues," Korthak began, his voice carrying the particular smugness of someone about to make a point. "Today we welcome our new combat instructor." A few antennae twitched. Combat instruction at the academy was typically handled by Veltaran shock troops or Quillian tactical specialists, species with actual military pedigree. Hiring outside the established order was unusual. From the 3rd spiral arm, Korthak continued, savoring each word like vintage fermentation fluid, representing a species that has recently achieved interstellar capability. Recently, Lieutenant Commander Jexhai whispered to her neighbor. "Didn't they just invent faster-than-light travel last week?" "Practically yesterday," came the reply. "Still using chemical propulsion for local transport?" Korthak gestured toward the academy's main entrance. "May I present our new professor?" She walked in like she owned the place, which was remarkable because she looked like she could barely afford to rent it. Human anatomy was awkward by galactic standards. Bilateral symmetry, single head, ridiculously limited limb configuration. But she moved with an economy of motion that made the assembled military brass suddenly conscious of their own posture. "Professor," Korthak said, the title dripping with barely concealed condescension, "perhaps you could introduce yourself to our faculty?" She stopped at the center of the amphitheater and looked up at the tiered seating. Her eyes, those bizarre forward-facing human eyes that gave the species such a limited field of vision, swept across the assembly without apparent concern for the fact that she was addressing some of the galaxy's most decorated military minds. "I teach people not to die," she said. The simplicity of it was almost insulting. Major Krindeth, whose dissertation on asymmetric warfare had been required reading at 17 military academies, felt his gill slits flutter with indignation. "Surely," Krindeth interjected, "your credentials extend beyond such elementary observations? Do they need to?" Admiral Vexandra leaned forward in her seat, her sensor tendrils quivering with curiosity. "General Korthak, perhaps you could elaborate on this instructor's qualifications?" Korthak's timing was impeccable. He'd clearly been waiting for this moment, probably rehearsing it in his mirror for weeks. With theatrical precision, he drew his sidearm, a military-grade plasma projector capable of punching through battle armor at 50 meters. "I believe," he said, "a demonstration would be more illuminating." The professor didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even seem particularly interested in the weapon now pointed at her center mass. "You know," she said conversationally, "most species do this part with training rounds." "Most species," Korthak replied, "haven't claimed they can teach hegemony officers anything worth learning." He fired. The weapon's discharge lit the amphitheater with plasma blue brilliance. At this range, even a glancing hit would vaporize most organic matter. The assembled faculty had collectively witnessed thousands of combat scenarios, participated in interdimensional conflicts, and commanded fleets that could sterilize planets. They knew what happened when plasma met flesh. What they had never seen was someone reach out and pluck a superheated energy projectile from mid-flight, like picking fruit. The professor held the plasma bolt in her right hand, its glow casting strange shadows on her face. The energy crackled between her fingers, dissipating harmlessly against her palm. "Interesting safety protocols," she observed. The silence that followed was the kind typically reserved for religious experiences or natural disasters. 300 cadets sat frozen in their seats, their various respiratory systems having momentarily forgotten how to function. Faculty members stared with the expressions of beings whose fundamental understanding of physics had just been politely contradicted. Colonel Yithamore was the first to find his voice, though it came out as more of a croak. That's impossible." "No," the professor corrected, closing her fist and extinguishing the plasma completely. "That's Tuesday." General Korthak's weapon arm trembled slightly. What are you?" "Disappointed," she replied. "I was expecting something more challenging than a basic energy projector. What's next? Harsh language?" Lieutenant Commander Jexhai turned to her companion, her whisper carrying clearly in the stunned silence. Did a human just catch plasma?" "Apparently," came the shaky response. "Either that, or we're all hallucinating." Admiral Vexandra's sensor tendrils were practically vibrating now. "Professor, how did you—" "Trade secret," the human interrupted. "Besides, if I explained it now, what would you learn in class?" She looked around the amphitheater with the sort of patient expression typically reserved for dealing with particularly slow children. "So, who's ready for Lesson 1? The faculty exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their collective state of mind. They'd invited what they assumed was a primitive being to provide some basic instruction in rudimentary combat techniques. Instead, they'd apparently hired someone who could violate the laws of physics as casually as filing paperwork. Major Crindeth cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should postpone the initial session? Allow time for proper preparation?" "Preparation for what?" For understanding what just happened?" The professor shrugged, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both sympathy and mild amusement. "You fired a weapon at someone you thought couldn't handle it. I handled it. Now we all know where we stand." She turned to address the cadets directly, her voice carrying easily through the amphitheater's acoustics. "How many of you have been in actual combat?" A few hands, and tentacles and appendages that didn't have proper names, rose hesitantly. "How many of you have been in combat where the enemy wasn't following regulations?" The raised appendages dropped. "Right," she said. "So we'll start with the basics. Tomorrow, 0700 hours, Training Ground 7. Bring something you're willing to break." She paused at the amphitheater's exit. "Oh, and General? Next time you want to make a point, try using training rounds. Live ammunition tends to make people nervous." Korthak stared at his weapon, then at the spot where the plasma bolt should have left a smoking crater. But how— "Next lesson, please," she said, and walked out. The silence stretched until Cadet Morvek, a young Altarian in his first semester, raised a tentative appendage. "Sir?" he asked. "Are we going to pretend this didn't happen?" Admiral Vexandra considered this question with the gravity it deserved. "Cadet, I honestly don't know what we're going to do." Which was, as it turned out, exactly the point. Training Ground 7 had been designed by committee, which explained why it resembled a geometry textbook's fever dream. Perfectly symmetrical obstacle courses, regulation height barriers, and standardized combat scenarios stretched across the manicured landscape like a monument to military bureaucracy. The professor stood at the center of this orchestrated perfection, looking profoundly unimpressed. "Right," she announced to the gathered cadets. "Forget everything you learned about fighting." Cadet Thekvor, whose people had been perfecting martial arts for 3 millennia, raised his primary manipulator. "Professor, with respect, our combat traditions predate your species' written language." Exactly the problem, she replied. Your combat traditions assume your enemy read the same manual. The human began walking toward the equipment lockers, her movement casual but purposeful. The cadets followed, their formations instinctively maintaining textbook spacing and posture. She glanced back at them and snorted. Stop that. Stop what? Asked Cadet Linsira, her bioluminescent patches flickering with confusion. Marching like you're in a parade. When's the last time anyone attacked you in formation? The cadets exchanged uncertain looks. Formation combat was fundamental. Every military academy in the hegemony taught synchronized unit tactics as basic curriculum. But Professor, Cadet Morvek ventured, coordinated movement maximizes efficiency and gets you killed faster, she interrupted, opening a locker and pulling out what appeared to be a standard training blade. Efficiency works when both sides agree on the rules. Survival works when rules don't exist. She tossed the weapon to Thekfor, who caught it with practiced ease. Attack me. I beg your pardon? You heard correctly. Use that blade. Try to tag me. Standard training protocol. Thekfor hefted the weapon, checking its balance with professional competence. His species had dominated the Academy's combat rankings for decades. Superior reflexes, forearmed coordination, and neural processing that bordered on precognitive. He lunged with textbook precision, blade aimed at the professor's shoulder in a regulation training strike. She wasn't there. More accurately, she was suddenly behind him, having moved with liquid efficiency around his attack. Her hand rested lightly on his neck. You're dead, she observed cheerfully. Who wants to explain why? The cadets stared. Thekfor was fast, genuinely fast by any galactic standard. His strike had been flawless, his form impeccable. He telegraphed his intention? Offered Linsira. Nope, perfect poker face. Insufficient speed? Suggested another cadet. Faster than most of your instructors, actually. Cadet Morvek's tentacles writhed with frustration. Then what went wrong? The professor released Thekfor, who spun around with wounded pride and considerable confusion. Nothing went wrong. He executed a perfect Academy-approved combat technique. But you evaded it. Because I don't follow Academy regulations. The statement hung in the air like a confession of heresy. The cadets had been raised on the principle that hegemony combat doctrine represented the pinnacle of military evolution, refined through centuries of analysis, tested against every conceivable scenario. Professor, Thekfor said carefully, are you suggesting our training is inadequate? I'm suggesting your training is predictable. She gestured toward the obstacle course. Every move you make follows established patterns. Every response falls within doctrinal parameters. You're not warriors. You're very athletic bureaucrats. From the observation deck, faculty members watched through scopes and sensors, their own confusion deepening by the minute. She's dismantling everything, muttered Commander Kellos to his colleagues. 3,000 years of military science, and she's treating it like amateur hour. Perhaps, suggested Dr. Nexilla from the Academy's Strategic Studies Department, she represents some form of enhanced human variant? Genetic modification seems the only logical explanation. For catching plasma? Admiral Vexandra's sensor tendrils twitched skeptically. There's no modification that should allow organic tissue to interact with coherent energy streams. Unless, Professor Yindar of Xenobiology interjected, we're fundamentally misunderstanding human physiology. Back on the training ground, the professor had armed herself with what appeared to be a broken piece of equipment housing. The cadets surrounded her in a loose semicircle, weapons drawn, looking like they were preparing to capture something dangerous. New exercise, she announced. All of you, simultaneously. Try to tag me. All of us. Cadet Zefkari's voice climbed an octave. That's 37 beings, Professor. I noticed. But the safety protocols were written by people who never fought for their lives. The cadets hesitated. Mass combat scenarios were advanced curriculum, typically reserved for senior students under heavily controlled conditions. Professor, Linsira said diplomatically, perhaps we should start with smaller group exercises? Why? Planning to fight your enemies one at a time? Thekvor stepped forward, his grip tightening on his training weapon. Very well, but don't blame us if you're overwhelmed. What followed defied several laws of physics and most principles of common sense. The human moved like water finding cracks, never quite where attacks expected her to be. She used their numbers against them, redirecting one cadet's momentum into another's path, turning their coordination into chaos. The broken equipment piece in her hand somehow blocked, deflected, and struck with equal effectiveness. Within 90 seconds, 37 Academy cadets lay scattered across the training ground in various states of bewildered defeat. Questions? She asked, not even breathing hard. The silence was broken by slow, deliberate applause from the observation deck. General Korthak had arrived, accompanied by what appeared to be half the Academy's senior staff. Impressive display, Korthak called down, though I'm curious about your teaching methodology. The professor shrugged. They needed to understand the difference between fighting and combat. And that difference is? Fighting follows rules. Combat writes them. Dr. Nexilla activated her communicator, her voice carrying clearly across the training ground. Professor, from a theoretical standpoint, could you elaborate on your tactical philosophy? No philosophy, came the reply. Just adaptation. Adaptation to what? The human looked up at the assembled faculty, her expression shifting to something almost sympathetic. To reality. Commander Kellos leaned forward. Reality. The universe doesn't care about your training manuals. Physics works regardless of regulations. Death ignores doctrine. She helped Cadet Morvek to his feet, her manner suddenly gentle. You're all excellent students. Perfect technique, flawless form, encyclopedic knowledge of tactical theory. You'd score top marks on any simulation. But, Thekvor asked, though he already knew the answer. But simulations don't shoot back with real intent to kill. Admiral Vexandra's sensor tendrils stilled completely, a sign of deep concentration among her people. Professor, what exactly do you mean by real intent to kill? The question seemed to genuinely surprise the human. You've never fought something that actually wanted you dead. Well, naturally, in military conflicts. No, the professor interrupted. I mean something that saw you as food, or territory to claim, or just an obstacle to remove. The faculty exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their collective experience with actual survival situations. Professor, Dr. Yindar asked slowly, what kind of world produces beings who fight with such necessity? The human smiled, and for the first time since arriving at the academy, it wasn't entirely pleasant. The kind where evolution isn't a theory. She turned back to the cadets, most of whom were still picking themselves up from their encounter with practical reality. Tomorrow we work on improvisation. Bring something that isn't a weapon, and I'll show you why it is. As she walked toward the exit, Cadet Linsira called after her. Professor, how do we prepare for that? You don't, she replied without turning around. That's the point. The assembled faculty watched her leave in silence, until Commander Kellos voiced what they were all thinking. I'm beginning to suspect we may have underestimated this species. Underestimated? General Korthak's laugh held no humor. My friend, I'm starting to think we don't understand them at all. The Academy's research division occupied 17 levels beneath the main campus, which was appropriate since most of the work done there involved digging into questions that polite society preferred to leave buried. Dr. Nexilla sat before a holographic display that currently showed the third spiral arm in uncomfortable detail. Specifically, it showed a small blue-green world that had somehow produced a being capable of treating advanced military doctrine like a mild inconvenience. The atmospheric composition alone should have killed them, she muttered, highlighting oxygen levels that registered as toxic by galactic standards. Corrosive gas mixture, electromagnetic radiation bombardment, seismic instability. Professor Yindar materialized beside her workstation, his chromatic hide still flickering with the nervous patterns he'd been displaying since yesterday's training session. Any progress on the physiological analysis? Progress? Nexilla's laugh contained several notes of hysteria. I've discovered that everything we thought we knew about evolutionary biology is apparently incorrect. She gestured at the display, where Earth rotated with what now seemed like ominous beauty. This planet is classified as a Category 12 death world. We don't establish research stations on Category 12 worlds, Yindar. We quarantine them. And yet they developed spaceflight. Developed? They weaponized, controlled explosions to escape their atmosphere. Their idea of propulsion is literally sitting on top of barely contained disasters. Admiral Vexandra's voice echoed from the chamber's entrance. Doctor, perhaps you could elaborate on your findings? The two scientists turned to find half the Academy's leadership filing into the research lab. General Korthak led the procession, followed by commanders, colonels, and department heads who rarely agreed on lunch selections, let alone matters of galactic significance. Admiral, Nexilla began diplomatically, our preliminary research has revealed certain anomalies, such as the fact that humans evolved in an environment that would kill most of us within minutes. Commander Kellos activated his personal shields reflexively. Surely that's hyperbole. Their star emits radiation levels that cause cellular breakdown in 87% of known species. Their atmosphere contains oxygen concentrations that would ignite most organic compounds. Their weather patterns include electrical storms powerful enough to disable military vessels. The assembled officers absorbed this information with the sort of thoughtful silence typically reserved for funeral services. Continue, Vexandra said quietly. Professor Yindar stepped forward, his color patterns now cycling through what his species used to indicate academic excitement. The fascinating element is how they adapted. Most civilizations develop on garden worlds, stable climates, benign stellar conditions, minimal predation. We know the standard evolutionary model, General Korthak said impatiently. Yes, but consider the implications. Our species learned to think, to cooperate, to build civilizations because our environments allowed contemplation. We had the luxury of philosophical development. And humans? Humans learned to think while being hunted. The statement hung in the air like a challenge to natural law. Dr. Nexilla pulled up a new display showing Earth's biodiversity statistics. Observe the predator-to-prey ratios, she said. Their world contains carnivorous species that hunt in coordinated packs, ambush predators with electromagnetic sensory capabilities, aerial hunters with supersonic dive speeds. Colonel Yithmore leaned forward. And humans survived this. How? By becoming better predators. The silence that followed was the kind that occurs when fundamental assumptions about reality shift suddenly and audibly. Doctor, Admiral Vexandra said carefully, are you suggesting that humans are natural predators? I'm suggesting that humans are natural everythings, Nexilla replied. Predator, prey, scavenger, tool user, problem solver. Their evolution demanded adaptability above all else. She highlighted a section of the planetary analysis. Their climate varies between extremes that would require us to use environmental suits. They developed biological systems capable of functioning across temperature, ranges that span our definition of habitability. Hence the combat effectiveness, Commander Kellos observed. Hence everything, Professor Yindar corrected. Combat, adaptation, improvisation, survival, it's all the same skill set refined over millions of years. General Korthak studied the data with growing unease. What you're describing sounds less like evolution and more like military conditioning. Now you're beginning to understand. The voice came from the lab's secondary entrance. The professor stood in the doorway, apparently having arrived without triggering any of the facility's sophisticated detection systems. How did you? Vexandra began. Security doors are just puzzles with electronic locks, the human replied, walking into the chamber with that same casual confidence she'd displayed since arrival. I knocked, but nobody heard me over the existential crisis. She examined the holographic display of Earth with the fond expression someone might reserve for embarrassing family photographs. Category 12 Death World. That's generous. I'd have rated it at least a 15. Professor, Dr. Nexilla said, her scientific curiosity overriding protocol. How is it possible for a species to develop higher cognitive functions in such a hostile environment? Who says the environment was hostile? The question reframed everything they'd been discussing. Several officers took involuntary steps backward. You consider that, Commander Kellos gestured at the display, a hospitable world? I consider it home, the professor replied. Everything you see as threats, we learn to see as challenges, or resources, or entertainment depending on the day. General Korthak's primary arms crossed defensively. Entertainment? Some of our most popular recreational activities involve deliberately placing ourselves in dangerous situations for fun. We call them sports. The assembled military leadership processed this information with visible difficulty. Professor, Admiral Vexandra asked slowly, what do you consider dangerous? The human appeared to give this serious consideration. Vacuum exposure, gamma radiation, antimatter containment failure, political dinner parties. And recreational? Running from predators, climbing unstable surfaces, controlled falling, competitive combat between individuals or teams. Professor Yindar's color patterns shifted to deep purple, a sign of profound philosophical disturbance among his people. You engage in combat, voluntarily? Multiple forms, hand-to-hand, weapon-based, group tactical scenarios, strategic simulations. We invented games that simulate warfare for entertainment purposes. Games? Thousands of them. Some involve physical competition, others test strategic thinking, many combine both. Children learn basic combat principles through play. The silence stretched until Dr. Nexilla found her voice. Children? How do you think we learn to catch bullets? General Korthak's weapon hand twitched reflexively. That's impossible. No, the professor corrected. That's childhood. We played games that involved dodging projectiles, catching thrown objects, predicting trajectory and timing. What you saw as impossible was just Tuesday's playground activity scaled up to military hardware. She moved to the holographic display and began highlighting various features of Earth's geography. Desert survival, Arctic endurance, jungle navigation, mountain climbing, oceanic challenges. We turned survival training into recreational activities because the baseline environment already provided adequate difficulty. Commander Kellos stared at the display with dawning comprehension. Your entire species trained for warfare from birth. We trained for survival, the human corrected. Warfare was just one application, But why? Admiral Vexandra's sensor tendrils quivered with genuine confusion. Why would any species choose such hardship? The professor smiled, and once again it wasn't entirely pleasant. We didn't choose it. It chose us. And the ones it didn't choose, well, they're not here to discuss evolutionary theory. She turned to address the entire assembly. You want to know why humans are effective fighters? It's not because we're naturally violent. It's because everything that made us human required us to solve problems that would kill us if we got the answer wrong. And now, General Korthak asked, now we solve problems for people who never learned that failure has consequences. The professor headed toward the exit, then paused. Oh, and Dr. Nexilla, you might want to adjust your threat assessment scales. If Earth only rates a category 12, I'd hate to see what you consider genuinely dangerous. After she left, the assembled officers stood in contemplative silence until Colonel Yeth Moore voiced what they were all thinking. I believe, he said quietly, we may have made a serious error in judgment. About hiring her? Vexandra asked. About assuming we were the advanced civilization in this relationship. The Academy's final assessment chamber had been designed to test the limits of military excellence. Holographic environments could simulate any battlefield from the last 1,000 years, project any enemy force configuration, and recreate the exact conditions of famous victories and defeats across galactic history. Today, it would host something unprecedented. A species evaluation. The Academy's entire leadership had assembled in the observation galleries. Word had spread through unofficial channels, and representatives from 12 different military academies across the hegemony had arrived to witness what their colleagues were describing as either a revolutionary training method or collective psychological breakdown. Assessment parameters? Admiral Vexandra asked. General Korthak consulted his display. Standard combat evaluation protocol, multiple threat scenarios, escalating difficulty, comprehensive tactical analysis. And the subject has requested we stop holding back. The professor stood in the center of the chamber, examining the pristine white walls with professional interest. She'd arrived wearing what appeared to be standard Academy exercise gear, carrying nothing but a water bottle and that same expression of mild amusement that had become disturbingly familiar. Professor, the intercom crackled, are you prepared to begin? Define begin, she replied. Standard threat assessment. Level 1 combat scenarios. Skip to something interesting. A pause. Level? 5? What's your maximum? Another pause, longer this time. Professor, Level 10 scenarios are designed for full combat teams, military specialists with decades of experience. Perfect. The chamber dissolved into chaos, not gradually, not with polite escalation, but instantly and completely. The holographic environment shifted to what the Academy's computers had designated as the most challenging combat scenario in their databases. Urban warfare against technologically superior opponents with air support, electronic countermeasures, and numerical advantage. Simulated energy weapons began firing immediately. What followed was less a combat scenario and more a physics demonstration. The professor moved through hostile fire like she was navigating a crowded marketplace, each step calculated to exploit gaps in enemy coverage that shouldn't have existed. She appropriated weapons from fallen opponents, used environmental features as tools, and seemed to predict enemy movements with supernatural accuracy. How is she doing that? Whispered Commander Zhelkos to his aide. Doing what, sir? Everything. The human had somehow acquired 3 different weapon systems, turned a collapsed building into a tactical advantage, and was currently using enemy air support against ground forces through what could only be described as creative applications of gravity and momentum. Pause simulation, Admiral Vexandra commanded. The chamber froze mid-chaos. The professor stood balanced on what had been debris, holding an improvised weapon configuration that violated several engineering principles, surrounded by the frozen forms of neutralized opponents. "Professor," Vexandra's voice carried clearly through the chamber, "could you explain your tactical approach?" "Which part?" "Any part." The human shrugged and dropped to ground level. "You see problems, I see opportunities. You see obstacles, I see tools. You see enemies, I see puzzles with motivations. But the coordination required, there was no coordination. I just did what worked." General Korthak leaned forward in his observation booth. "Professor, what you just accomplished required split-second analysis of multiple variables, predictive modeling of enemy behavior, and resource optimization under extreme pressure." "So?" "So those are advanced computational processes that typically require integrated tactical systems and extensive training." "Or," the professor said, "they're basic survival skills." She gestured at the frozen scenario around her. "Everything you just saw was pattern recognition. Humans are very good at patterns. We had to be. The thing hunting you yesterday might hunt you again tomorrow, so you learn to predict behavior. The storm that destroyed your shelter last season might return next year, so you learn to read weather signs. The food source that poisoned your cousin might look appealing to you, so you learn to recognize danger." Dr. Nexilla's voice came through the intercom, tight with scientific frustration. "Professor, you're describing capabilities that evolution shouldn't produce. Pattern recognition of that sophistication requires neural complexity beyond what environmental pressure alone could develop." "You're thinking about this backwards," the human replied. "You assume intelligence developed despite environmental pressure? We developed intelligence because of it." She began walking toward the chamber's exit. "Resume your scenario if you want. Run level 20 if you have it. But you're asking the wrong questions." "What should we be asking?" Admiral Vexandra called. The professor stopped at the threshold. "Why you hired me." Silence filled the observation galleries as the implications settled. General Korthak consulted his files, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching alarm. "Computer," he said slowly, "display original hiring authorization for human combat instructor." The main display filled with bureaucratic documentation. Admiral Vexandra read aloud, "Special Initiative, Hegemony Council Directive 77 Alpha. Purpose, assessment of human military potential for integration scenarios." "Integration scenarios?" Commander Kellos asked. More files appeared. Classified reports, strategic assessments, council deliberations marked with the highest security classifications. "They weren't hiring a teacher," Professor Yindar said quietly. "They were conducting an evaluation." The professor smiled from the doorway. "There we go." "An evaluation of what?" Vexandra demanded. "Whether humans would make better allies or enemies." The statement hung in the air like a weapons-targeting laser. In the observation galleries, military officers who had spent their careers preparing for theoretical conflicts suddenly found themselves contemplating a very practical one. "Professor," General Korthak said carefully, "what conclusion should we draw from this evaluation?" "That depends," she replied, "on whether you're planning to be reasonable neighbors or if you're going to do something that makes us treat you like a threat." Commander Jelkos leaned over to his colleague. "Is she threatening us?" "I don't think so," came the whispered reply. "I think she's warning us." The professor checked her water bottle, apparently finding the galaxy-spanning political implications less interesting than hydration management. "The thing about humans is, we're very adaptable. We can be peaceful, cooperative, even friendly. We're excellent at trade, diplomacy, cultural exchange." She paused. "We're also very good at the other thing." "Which is?" Admiral Vexandra asked, though her sensor tendril suggested she already knew. "Removing obstacles." Dr. Nex-Illa's voice carried a note of academic fascination. Professor, from a theoretical standpoint, what would constitute obstacle behavior? Aggression toward our worlds, interference with our development, attempts to subjugate or control us, standard imperial expansion policies. The human's tone remained conversational. Basically, anything you do to a species you considered primitive. The implications crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. General Korthak's weapon hands moved reflexively toward his sidearms before he caught himself. So, Admiral Vexandra said slowly, this has been a mutual evaluation. Obviously, you think we'd send someone to teach at your most prestigious military academy without learning something about your capabilities? She gestured towards the observation galleries filled with the hegemony's finest military minds. Turns out, you're very good at fighting the kind of wars you understand. Very sophisticated tactical doctrine, excellent coordination, impressive technological integration. But, Commander Kellos asked, but you've never fought anyone who didn't agree to follow the same rules. The professor finished her water and headed for the exit. The good news is, humans prefer cooperation to conflict, much more efficient. The bad news is, we're very good at making that preference convincing. And your recommendation? General Korthak asked. She turned back one final time, and her smile contained the same casual confidence she'd displayed when catching a plasma bolt 3 days ago. Same as always, she said. Don't make us treat you like a threat. After she left, the assembled military leadership sat in contemplative silence until Admiral Vexandra voiced what they were all thinking. I believe, she said quietly, we may have been approaching this entire relationship from the wrong perspective. How so? Asked General Korthak. We thought we were evaluating them. She gestured toward the chamber where the human had just demonstrated capabilities that redefined their understanding of individual combat effectiveness. I think they've been evaluating us. In the Academy's communication center, a priority message was already being transmitted to the Hegemony Council. Its contents would spark 3 days of emergency sessions and result in the most significant diplomatic policy revision in galactic history. The message was brief. Recommend immediate reclassification of human species from potential subjects to essential allies. Detailed report to follow. Suggest extreme urgency in establishing formal diplomatic relations. It was signed by every officer present at the evaluation, because if there was one thing the galaxy's finest military minds had learned over the past 3 days, it was the difference between being civilized and being safe. And they'd just discovered which one humans had learned to prioritize.